I never expected that one night by the sea would change how I saw my own son. But I guess that's the thing about expectations. They're just promises you make to yourself before life comes along and breaks every single one of them. It started like any other Friday in late August, the kind where the humidity clings to your skin like a second layer and the air conditioning in our suburban Chicago house struggles to keep up. I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at the pile of mail on the granite countertop, half listening to the distant sound of my husband Mark yelling at the TV during some preseason football game. Our son Ethan was upstairs in his room, probably glued to his phone like every other 17-year-old, scrolling through Instagram or texting his girlfriend Chloe, who he'd been dating for almost 2 years now. The house felt normal, lived in, the kind of chaotic quiet that comes with a family that's been together long enough to take each other for granted. I was 39 then, a graphic designer working from home, juggling client deadlines with the eternal balancing act of keeping a household running. Mark was 42, a project manager at a construction firm, the kind of guy who still wore his college baseball cap on weekends and could fix just about anything with a wrench and some duct tape. We had our routines, our rhythm. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. At least I thought we were. You always think you are, until the moment you realize you've been sleepwalking through your own life. That Friday, Mark suggested we take a spontaneous trip to the lake house, his family's old property on the shores of Lake Michigan, about 2 hours north. It wasn't a big deal, nothing fancy, just a tiny 3-bedroom cottage with a sagging porch and the kind of dusty furniture that smells like mothballs in forgotten summers. We hadn't been there in over a year, and I could tell Mark was feeling nostalgic, maybe even restless. He'd been working 60-hour weeks for months, and the dark circles under his eyes were starting to look permanent. I agreed, because sometimes the path of least resistance is easier than admitting that the distance between you and your spouse is growing wider by the day. Ethan didn't want to come. Of course he didn't. He had plans to hang out with Chloe and his friends. The usual teenage excuses that sound urgent, but really just mean they want to get drunk in someone's backyard without parents around. But Mark put his foot down, something he rarely did, and told Ethan it was family time, non-negotiable. I watched this silent war play out between them, the way Ethan's jaw tightened and his eyes flickered with that familiar teenage disdain, the kind that says, "You don't understand me, and you never will." But in the end, he packed a bag anyway, tossing it into the back of Mark's black Ford F-150 with a look of pure martyrdom. The drive up was uneventful. The radio played some classic rock station Mark loved, and Ethan sat in the back, earbuds in, staring out the window at the endless cornfields that seemed to swallow the highway whole. I stared at the back of Mark's head, at the way his shoulders hunched forward as he drove, and I felt this strange tug of something I couldn't quite name. Not love, exactly, but maybe comfort. The kind of comfort that comes from knowing a person so deeply that you can predict every gesture, every sigh, every joke before it leaves their lips. And yet, even in that comfort, there was an emptiness I'd been trying to ignore. A quiet little voice in the back of my mind that asked, "Is this it? Is this all there is?" We arrived at the lake house just before sunset. The sky was on fire, that brilliant orange-pink that only happens in the Midwest when the air is thick with summer heat and the clouds hang low like brushstrokes. I remember stepping out of the truck and smelling the water immediately, that mix of algae and wet sand and something ancient underneath. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the white paint peeling on the shutters, the porch swing creaking in the breeze. But there was something peaceful about it, something that felt like a pause button on the chaos of real life. Mark unlocked the door and we stepped inside. It was musty, the air heavy with the absence of time. We spent the first hour opening windows, flicking on lights, checking for spiders and corners. Ethan ground and claimed the smallest bedroom, the one with the twin bed and the nautical-themed wallpaper that hadn't been updated since the 80s. He slammed the door behind him, and I heard the muffled sound of his voice, probably on the phone with Chloe, complaining about how boring this was. I smiled to myself, because I remembered being that age, when your parents' idea of a good time was the most excruciating torture imaginable. That evening, we grilled burgers on the old Wonder Barbecue, and Mark opened a bottle of cheap red wine he'd brought. We sat on the porch, the three of us, while the sounds of the lake drifted up from the water. Crickets, the distant hum of a boat motor, the soft lapping of waves against the wooden dock. It was almost idyllic, the kind of scene that could have been on a postcard. But even then, I noticed the cracks. Ethan barely spoke to Mark, answering every question with a one-word grunt. Mark tried too hard, telling old stories about his childhood summers here, stories Ethan had heard 1,000 times. And me, I just sat there, swirling my wine, feeling like I was watching a movie about someone else's family. By midnight, the wine was gone, and so was the suburban Chicago heat. The air had cooled into something crisp, and I felt the buzz of alcohol loosening the knots in my shoulders. Mark was tipsy, laughing at nothing, his arms slung around me in a way that felt more performative than affectionate. Ethan had wandered down to the dock, his silhouette visible against the moonlit water, phone glowing in his hand like a tiny lighthouse. I told Mark I was going to walk down and check on him, just to make sure he wasn't doing anything stupid, like trying to swim drunk or text Chloe something he'd regret. The dock boards groaned under my bare feet as I walked. The lake stretched out in front of me, dark and endless, the moon laying a silver path across the surface like something out of a dream. I could see Ethan standing at the very edge, his back to me, his shoulders hunched in that way they always were when he was upset. I called his name softly, but he didn't turn. So I walked closer, close enough to hear the low murmur of his voice. He was on the phone, and the tone in his voice wasn't the casual, annoyed tone he used with Chloe. It was softer, more vulnerable, the kind of voice he only used when he thought no one was listening. I froze, my foot hovering over the next board, because I didn't want to intrude on a private moment. But then I heard my name. "She just doesn't get it," he said, and my heart stuttered. She's so caught up in her own world, she doesn't even see what's right in front of her. Dad, too. They're both clueless. I held my breath, not daring to move. I told myself I shouldn't be eavesdropping, that this was wrong, that every mother knows her son deserves privacy. But I stayed, because something in his voice frightened me. It wasn't just teenage angst. It was something deeper, something weighted with a pain I hadn't seen before. "I can't keep pretending," and his voice cracked. "It's eating me alive. Every time I look at her, I just see what she did, and she doesn't even know that I know." My pulse was hammering now, loud in my ears. Who was he talking to? Chloe? One of his friends? I tried to piece it together, but the pieces didn't fit. What did he know? What had she done? He paused, listening to the voice on the other end. Then he laughed, but it was hollow, bitter. "Yeah, I know. I should just confront her. But how do you look your own mother in the eye and tell her you know she's been lying to Dad for months?" The world tilted. The dock swayed beneath me. Or maybe that was just my knees giving out. I reached for the railing, my hand shaking, my mind screaming. Months? What was he talking about? I've been married to Mark for 19 years. I've never lied. Not about anything that mattered. Not about the kind of thing that would make my son look at me like I was a stranger. I took a step back, the board groaning louder than before, and this time Ethan heard it. He spun around, his face illuminated by the phone screen, and in that split second, I saw something I'd never seen in my child before. Not anger, not surprise, but something colder, something like disdain. "Mom?" His voice was flat, emotionless. "What are you doing here?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The moonlight caught his eyes, and I realized with a sickening jolt that I didn't recognize the person standing in front of me. This wasn't my son, the little boy who used to make me paper boats and leave love notes in my purse. This was a stranger wearing my son's face, carrying a secret that was about to shatter everything I thought I knew. I was just coming to check on you," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see him weighing his options, calculating what to say next. Then he sighed, a heavy, exhausted sigh, and looked back out at the water. "You should go inside," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. "It's late, and honestly, I don't really want to talk to you right now." I should have demanded answers. I should have grabbed his shoulders and shaken the truth out of him, but I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, while my 17-year-old son dismissed me like I was nothing. And in that moment, standing on that creaking dock with the cold lake wind biting at my skin, I realized that something had gone terribly wrong in my life, something I hadn't even known to look for. I turned and walked back to the house, my feet moving on autopilot, my mind a hurricane of questions. I didn't tell Mark. I couldn't. Because what would I say? Our son thinks I'm a liar? Our son looks at me with hatred in his eyes? I lay in bed that night, listening to Mark's soft snoring, staring at the ceiling, and I replayed Ethan's words over and over again. I know she's been lying to Dad for months. But I hadn't been lying. I'd been right here, every single night, cooking dinner, paying bills, pretending that everything was fine. Unless there was something I'd forgotten, something I'd buried so deep that even I couldn't find it anymore. That was the night I started to question myself, and that was the night I realized that one conversation by the sea had already changed everything. The rest of that weekend at the lake house was a masterclass in pretending. I woke up the next morning with a headache that had nothing to do with the cheap wine and everything to do with the conversation I'd overheard on the dock. Mark was already up, clattering around in the tiny kitchen, trying to make coffee with a percolator that looked older than me. I lay there for a long time, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that vaguely resembled the state of Florida, and I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined it all. Maybe I'd misheard. Maybe Ethan had been talking about someone else, some other woman, some other lie. But deep down, in that place where you know the truth even when you don't want to, I knew he'd been talking about me. I got up and went through the motions, showered in the rusty stall that never quite got hot enough,
pulled on a pair of old jeans and a t-shirt that had paint stains from a project I'd abandoned months ago, walked into the kitchen and smiled at Mark like nothing was wrong, like my entire world hadn't tilted on its axis 12 hours earlier. He handed me a mug of coffee, black, the way I always drank it, and I took it like it was a lifeline. Ethan came downstairs eventually, his hair wet from a shower, his eyes avoiding mine like I was radioactive. He grabbed a granola bar and muttered something about going for a walk, and then he was gone, the screen doors slamming behind him with a bang that made me flinch. Mark didn't notice. He was too busy planning the day, talking about taking the old rowboat out, maybe grilling fish if he could catch any. I nodded along, making the right sounds, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. It was back on that dock, replaying every syllable of what Ethan had said. Lying to Dad for months? What could that possibly mean? I cataloged every month of the past year in my head, searching for any gap, any forgotten evening, any moment that could be twisted into something sinister. I'd had girls' nights out, sure, a few late nights at the office finishing client projects, but nothing that would raise an eyebrow, nothing that would make my own son look at me with that cold, knowing hatred. By midday, the sun was brutal, the kind of heat that makes the lake steam and the dragonflies hover like tiny helicopters. I sat on the porch with a book I wasn't reading, while Mark worked on patching a hole in the old canoe. Ethan was back from his walk, sitting on the dock with his feet dangling over the water, his phone nowhere in sight for once. I watched him from a distance, trying to see the little boy I'd raised, trying to find some trace of the child who used to hold my hand crossing the street and tell me I was the prettiest mommy in the whole world. But all I saw was a stranger. A tall, lean young man with his father's jaw and my eyes, sitting there like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. I couldn't take it anymore. I closed my book, set it down on the porch swing, and walked down to the dock. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, but I forced myself to keep going, one foot in front of the other, the hot wood burning my bare soles. Ethan didn't look up when I sat down next to him, keeping a careful distance between us. The water lapped gently against the posts, and a boat with a family of tourists puttered by in the distance, their laughter carrying across the lake like a mockery of our tension. "Ethan," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "we need to talk about what I heard last night." He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, just stared straight ahead at the horizon, his jaw set in that stubborn line I knew so well. "I don't know what you think you heard," he said finally, his tone flat, dismissive, "but I wasn't talking about you." "You said my name," I pressed, hating how desperate I sounded. "You said I'd been lying to your dad. What did you mean by that?" He turned to look at me then, and the expression on his face made my blood run cold. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was pity. That was worse. Much worse. "You really don't remember, do you?" he asked, and there was something almost sad in his voice, like he was looking at a wounded animal that didn't know it was bleeding. "Remember what?" My voice cracked on the last word.
and I hated myself for it. Ethan let out a long breath, running his hand through his wet hair. He looked older than 17 in that moment, weighed down by something I couldn't see but could feel, a heavy presence between us like a third person on the dock. "Last spring," he said, his voice low, careful. "April. You went on that work trip to New York. The conference, you said. 3 days, Thursday through Sunday." I nodded slowly, because yes, I remembered that. A design conference in Manhattan, one I'd been looking forward to for months. I'd stayed at the W Hotel in Midtown, attended panels during the day, networked with other designers in the evenings. It had been exhausting but energizing, a welcome break from the monotony of suburban life. "I remember," I said, "a design conference in Manhattan, one I'd been looking forward to for months. I'd stayed at the W Hotel in Midtown, attended panels during the day, networked with other designers in the evenings. It had been exhausting but energizing, a welcome break from the monotony of suburban life." "I remember," I said. "What does that have to do with anything?" Ethan's eyes held mine, and I saw something flicker there, something raw and painful that he'd been carrying alone for far too long. "I saw you," he said, each word dropping like a stone. "Not in person, on Chloe's phone. Her cousin was in New York that weekend, some internship thing, and she posted a story from this rooftop bar. You were in it. You and some guy. A guy who wasn't Dad." The world went silent. The birds stopped chirping. The water stopped lapping. The distant boat engine faded to nothing. There was only the roaring in my ears and the slow, dawning horror spreading through my chest like ice water in my veins. I don't know what you're talking about," I whispered. But even as I said it, a memory was clawing its way up from the depths of my mind. A rooftop bar, a glass of white wine, a handsome stranger who'd sat down next to me and started talking about the city lights, about art, about how beautiful the sky looked from up so high. We'd talked for hours, I remembered that now. We'd laughed, and he'd touched my arm, and I'd let him, because it felt good to be seen, really seen, by someone who had no idea I was a tired mom from the suburbs with a stack of unpaid bills and a marriage that had gone stale. "You don't know what I'm talking about?" Ethan repeated, his voice rising now, the anger breaking through the carefully constructed calm. "Mom, I saw you. You were leaning into him, laughing, and he had his hand on your knee. I rewound that story 10 times because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then I went back and checked your texts, the ones you sent Dad that weekend. You told him you were at a networking dinner with a group of colleagues. You told him you were alone in your hotel room by 11 every night. But I saw the timestamp on that story. It was past midnight, and you were definitely not alone." I couldn't breathe. The dock was tilting again. Or maybe it was just me, my body swaying toward the water like I might fall in and never come back up. I remembered that night now fully, with the clarity that only comes when you're forced to look at something you've worked hard to forget. The stranger's name was David. He was an architect from Boston, also at the conference, also married, also tired of the life he'd built. We'd shared a cab back to the hotel, and he'd kissed me in the elevator. I'd let him. I'd kissed him back. And then I'd gone to my room and lain awake all night, disgusted with myself, terrified of what I'd almost done. I never saw him again after that weekend. I never told a soul. I buried it so deep I'd almost convinced myself it never happened. But I hadn't buried it deep enough. "Ethan," I started, reaching for him. But he pulled away like my touch was poison. "Don't," he snapped, his eyes blazing. "Don't try to explain. There's no explanation that makes this okay. You cheated. Even if it was just a kiss, even if it was just one night of flirting, you cheated. And then you came home and smiled at Dad like nothing happened. You made dinner, you helped me with my history project, you acted like the perfect wife and mother. But I knew. I've known for 4 months, and I've been carrying it alone, trying to figure out what to do, how to even look at you without throwing up." Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and shameful, but I didn't wipe them away. I didn't deserve to. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice broken. "Why didn't you confront me sooner?" He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that cut through me like a blade. "Because I didn't want to believe it.
he said.
I kept telling myself I was wrong, that it was a trick of the light, that it wasn't you. I even convinced myself for a while that maybe you had a twin sister I didn't know about. Stupid, right? But the truth is, I didn't want to blow up our family. I thought maybe if I gave you enough time, you'd confess on your own. I thought you were a better person than that. But the months went by and you never said a word. And every day, watching you act like everything was fine, I felt a little more of my respect for you die. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I wanted to tell him it was just one moment of weakness, a mistake, a lapse in judgment that I regretted every single day. But what would that change? He was right. I'd kept the secret. I'd let the lie fester. And in doing so, I'd lost the trust of the one person whose opinion mattered most. What do you want me to do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What can I possibly do to fix this? Ethan shook his head, and in that moment he looked so much like his father that it hurt. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know if there's anything you can do, because the worst part isn't even what you did. It's that you made me a liar too. I've been lying to Dad for 4 months, keeping your secret, pretending I don't see you differently. I hate myself for it, and I hate you for making me hate myself. He stood up then, brushing off his shorts, and walked away without another word. I stayed on the dock, frozen, tears still streaming, watching my son disappear into the house where his father was waiting, completely unaware that the last traces of our happy family were crumbling around us like sand. That night, I couldn't eat. I pushed my food around my plate while Mark talked about the fish he'd caught, and Ethan sat in stony silence, and I felt like I was drowning in plain sight. When we went to bed, I stared at the ceiling again, and for the first time in 19 years, I wished Mark would roll over and ask me what was wrong. But he didn't. He just snored, blissfully ignorant, while I lay awake replaying the worst mistake of my life and wondering how I'd ever thought I could outrun it. I didn't tell Mark the next morning, or the day after that, or even after we packed up and drove home. I couldn't, because telling him meant admitting I was the villain of this story, and I wasn't ready to face that yet. But Ethan's words haunted me every second of the drive back, every time I saw Mark in the rearview mirror, every time Ethan caught my eye in the passenger seat and looked away. The only thing I knew for certain was that I'd never expected that one night by the sea to change how I saw my own son, but it had, and now I had to figure out how to live with what I'd done. The drive back to Chicago was the longest 2 hours of my life. Mark kept the radio on some sports talk station, and I stared out the passenger window at the endless fields of corn and soybeans, watching them blur into a green and gold smear. Ethan sat directly behind me, and I could feel his eyes on the back of my head the entire way, a silent accusation that burned through the seat and into my skull. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because I knew what I'd see if I did, that cold, pitying disappointment that had replaced the love in his eyes, and I wasn't strong enough to face it again. We pulled into our driveway just after 6, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the manicured lawn and the flower beds I'd spent so many weekends nurturing. The house looked the same as when we'd left it, white with black shutters, the American flag Mark insisted on flying from the porch, the basketball hoop in the driveway that Ethan hadn't used in years. It was the picture of suburban normalcy, the kind of home that real estate agents photograph for brochures. It was the picture of suburban normalcy, the kind of home that real estate agents photograph for brochures, the kind that made people say, they look like they have it all. And in that moment, standing on the welcome mat with my keys in my hand, I felt like a fraud. The house had always been my sanctuary, the place where I could shut out the world and just exist. But now it felt like a cage, every room a reminder of the lie I'd been living. Mark carried our bags inside, grunting about how good it was to be home, how he missed his own pillow, how he needed a real shower with actual water pressure. I watched him disappear down the hallway toward the master bedroom, his shoulders broad and familiar, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. And I wondered, for the first time in our entire marriage, if I even deserved to share a bed with him anymore. The thought made my stomach churn, a sickening wave of guilt that threatened to bring up the granola bar I choked down that morning. Ethan headed straight for the stairs, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder, not even glancing in my direction. I knew that door was going to slam, and I braced myself for it, counting the seconds until the sound echoed through the house. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard his footsteps pause at the top of the stairs, then the soft creak of his bedroom door opening and closing with an almost deliberate gentleness. That was worse, somehow. The slam would have been anger, and anger I could handle. The quiet door was something else entirely. It was resignation, the acceptance of a truth that couldn't be undone. That first week back was a waking nightmare. I went through the motions of my life like an actress playing a role I'd memorized too well. Wake up, make coffee, pack Ethan's lunch even though he'd started buying cafeteria food just to avoid me.
Sit at my desk and stare at the computer screen, moving pixels around in Photoshop, while my mind replayed every horrible moment from the dock. Attend Zoom meetings with clients, smiling and nodding, while a voice in my head screamed that I was a liar and a cheat and a fraud. Cook dinner, act normal. Pretend that the tension in our house wasn't so thick you could cut it with a knife. Mark noticed, of course. He wasn't stupid, just oblivious in the way that husbands sometimes are when they're comfortable. He asked me if I was feeling okay, if I was stressed about work, if I wanted to go out for dinner to get my mind off things. I made excuses, the same flimsy ones I'd been making for years, and he accepted them because he trusted me. That trust was a blade, and every time he touched me, a hand on my lower back as I washed dishes, a kiss on the cheek before he left for work, it twisted a little deeper. I started flinching without meaning to, pulling away from his touch like it might burn me. He didn't say anything, but I saw the confusion in his eyes, the quiet hurt that he tried to hide behind his easy smile. Ethan's behavior shifted too, but in a different direction. He stopped coming home right after school, disappearing for hours at a time. He'd text Mark with vague explanations, studying at the library, grabbing food with friends, working on a group project, and Mark would nod and tell me about it like it was normal teenage behavior. But I knew the truth. Ethan was avoiding me, the same way I was avoiding Mark. We were two people caught in a dance of avoidance, tiptoeing around each other in our own home, and the worst part was that we both knew exactly what the other was doing. I started checking his location on my phone, something I'd never done before. I told myself it was because I was worried, because he was still my son, and I had a right to know where he was, but really, it was because I was scared.
Scared of what he might be doing, who he might be telling, what he might be planning. Would he tell Chloe? Her parents? His friends? Would he tell Mark, finally, and let the grenade I'd been carrying explode? I watched that little blue dot on my screen, tracking his movements across town, and I felt like a stalker in my own life. Then, on a Thursday evening exactly 10 days after the lake house, it happened. Mark was working late, something about a zoning permit that had gone sideways, and I was alone in the living room with a glass of wine I didn't want and the TV on mute. Ethan walked in through the front door, his face flushed from the cold October air that had finally started creeping in, and he stopped when he saw me. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without a word, he walked past me and sat down on the opposite end of the couch, leaving a gap between us that felt as wide as the ocean. "Mom," he said, not looking at me, "we need to talk." My heart dropped. I'd been dreading those words for days, imagining every possible version of that conversation. This was it. The moment when my son was going to tell me he was done, that he was going to his father, that he couldn't keep lying anymore. "I know what you're thinking," he continued, his voice low and careful. "But I'm not going to tell Dad. Not yet, anyway." I blinked, my brain struggling to process what he'd just said. What? He turned to look at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in weeks. Not pity, not hatred, something closer to exhaustion, like he'd been carrying the weight of my secret for so long that his shoulders were permanently slumped. "I've been thinking about it a lot," he said. "The whole drive home, every night lying in bed, every time I watched you pretend to be happy. I thought about telling Dad. I almost did, like a dozen times. But then I asked myself what that would actually accomplish."
"Ethan, I don't understand." "It would destroy him." He cut me off, his voice harder now. "It would destroy all of us.
Dad would freak out, probably file for divorce, and then what? You'd sell the house, I'd have to split my time between two places, everything we've built would just disappear. And for what? One stupid night in New York with some guy you never even saw again? I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain, but he held up a hand and stopped me. Don't, he said. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to know his name or what happened or if you loved him or whatever. I've been in my own head for 4 months, and I've decided that the only way I survive this is if I stop thinking about it. So here's the deal. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made me feel like a child in detention. I'm not going to tell Dad, he repeated, but you're going to fix this. You're going to be better. You're going to start actually loving him the way he deserves, not just going through the motions. And you're going to be a better mom, too. I know you've been pretending for a long time, even before New York. I've seen the way you look at Dad like you're bored. I've seen the way you retreat into your phone whenever he tries to talk to you. That stops now. A tear slipped down my cheek, but I didn't dare wipe it away. Ethan, I'm so sorry, I whispered. I never meant to. I know you didn't mean to, he said, and his voice cracked just a little. That's the worst part. You didn't mean to hurt us, but you did anyway. And now I have to live with the fact that my mom isn't who I thought she was. So yeah, I'm giving you a chance. But it's the only one you're getting. If I ever catch you slipping again, if I ever even suspect you're hiding something else, I won't hesitate. I'll tell Dad everything, and I'll walk away from you and never look back.
He stood up, his body tense with the effort of holding himself together. I love you, Mom, he said, and the words hit me harder than any accusation could. I just don't trust you. That's going to take a long time to fix, if it ever gets fixed at all. And then he walked upstairs, leaving me alone on the couch with a cold glass of wine and the shattered remains of my carefully constructed identity. That night, I sat in the dark for hours, thinking about everything he'd said. My 17-year-old son had just handed me an ultimatum, and he was right to do it. I'd been sleepwalking through my marriage for longer than I wanted to admit, taking Mark for granted, treating our life together like a comfortable old shoe I was too lazy to replace. The New York incident was just a symptom of a much deeper rot, the emptiness I'd been ignoring, the loneliness I'd buried under deadlines and grocery lists, and the endless mundane rituals of being a wife and mother. Mark came home around 11, tired and grumbling about work, and I met him at the door. I wrapped my arms around him and held him tighter than I'd held him in years, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne and the faint smell of construction dust that always clung to his clothes. He was surprised, but he hugged me back, his big hands rubbing circles on my back like he used to do in the early days of our marriage. Hey, he said, pulling back to look at me. Everything okay? You seem different. I forced a smile, the kind I'd worn 1,000 times before. Just missed you, that's all. He kissed my forehead, and I felt the love in that gesture, so pure and trusting and undeserved. But I also felt the weight of Ethan's words pressing down on me, reminding me that I had work to do. Hard work. The kind of work that meant stripping away every defense I'd built, every excuse, every carefully practiced lie. That night, I lay in bed next to Mark, and I started making a list in my head.
Not a physical list, but a mental one. All the ways I'd let him down. All the moments I'd been physically present, but emotionally absent. All the conversations I'd cut short, the touches I'd shrugged off, the passion I'd let die in the name of convenience. It was a long list, longer than I'd expected. And looking at it, I realized that Ethan hadn't just caught me in one mistake. He'd caught me in a pattern, a slow-motion unraveling that I'd been too blind to see. I didn't sleep well that night, but for the first time in months, I woke up the next morning with something I'd lost somewhere along the way. Purpose. I was going to save my marriage. I was going to be a better mother. And I was going to spend every single day earning back the trust of the son who'd looked at me in the moonlight and seen the truth I'd been hiding from myself. The weeks that followed were a slow, painful reconstruction of everything I'd let crumble. I threw myself into the work of being present, really present, in a way I hadn't been in years. I started waking up before Mark to make him breakfast, not just coffee and a granola bar, but actual eggs and toast, the way I used to when we were first married. I'd pack his lunch with little notes tucked inside, silly things that reminded him of our early dating days, inside jokes and references to movies we'd watched 100 times. At first, he looked at me like I'd grown a second head, but gradually I saw the confusion in his eyes soften into something warmer, something that looked a lot like hope. I also made a conscious effort with Ethan. He'd made it clear he didn't trust me, and I knew that trust couldn't be earned with grand gestures or hollow apologies, so I started small. I listened when he talked, really listened, instead of half-heartedly nodding while scrolling through my phone. I asked about Chloe, about his classes, about his friends, and I remembered the details.
I didn't pry or push, didn't try to force conversations he clearly wasn't ready to have. I just made myself available, a quiet presence in the background of his life, waiting for him to decide if he wanted to let me back in. The changes in our household were subtle at first, the kind of thing an outsider might not even notice, but Mark felt them. I saw it in the way his shoulders relaxed when he walked through the door, the way he started talking to me again, like I was a person he actually wanted to talk to, not just a roommate he shared bills with. He started bringing me flowers on random Tuesdays, the cheap grocery store bouquets he knew I loved. He started touching me more, not just the absent-minded pats on the back he'd defaulted to, but real touches. His hand on my waist, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw, his lips brushing my forehead when I was washing dishes. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't flinch. I leaned into him, let myself feel the warmth of his body against mine, and I realized how much I'd missed this, how much I'd missed him. But even as the walls between us started to come down, there was still the unspoken thing, the elephant in every room we walked into. Ethan knew, I knew, and Mark didn't. That secret sat between Ethan and me like a third person, a silent witness to every family dinner, every movie night, every laugh we shared. I'd catch Ethan's eye across the dinner table sometimes, and I'd see the flicker of something dark pass across his face before he looked away. He was keeping his promise, but it was costing him something. I could see it in the way he tensed up when Mark kissed me, in the way he'd leave the room whenever we got too affectionate. He was trying, just like I was. But trying and succeeding weren't the same thing. One Friday night in late November, Mark came home from work with a bottle of expensive champagne and a sly grin on his face.
He told me he'd managed to get reservations at that fancy Italian place downtown, the one we'd been talking about for years but never actually gone to. I was hesitant at first. Things were still fragile between Ethan and me, and the thought of leaving him alone for a whole evening felt like a step backward. But Mark was so excited. His eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning, and I couldn't say no. So I put on a dress I hadn't worn in years, the black one with the low back that used to drive him crazy, and I let him whisk me away. The restaurant was everything he'd promised, candlelit and intimate, with a waiter who spoke with an authentic Italian accent, and a wine list as thick as a novel. Mark ordered for both of us, something he hadn't done since our honeymoon, and I let him. I sipped my champagne and watched him talk, really talk, about his work, his dreams, his fears, all the things he'd been holding back because he thought I wasn't listening. And I realized, with a pang of guilt so sharp it made me wince, how much of his inner world I'd been missing. He wasn't just the guy who fixed the garbage disposal and mowed the lawn. He was a person, a complex, flawed, beautiful person who had been reaching for me all along, and I'd been too caught up in my own emptiness to reach back. "I feel like I'm falling in love with you all over again," he said at one point, his hand covering mine on the tablecloth. "I know it sounds cheesy, but it's true. These past few weeks, you've been different, more present, more you, and I don't know what changed, but I'm grateful for it." I looked at him, this man I'd married almost 20 years ago, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Not sad tears, just the overwhelming weight of how close I'd come to losing everything, and how mercifully, miraculously, I'd been given a second chance. "I'm grateful too," I managed, my voice thick. "I'm grateful for you, Mark, for everything."
I don't say it enough, but I know I don't deserve you. He laughed and squeezed my hand. You deserve everything. Don't ever let yourself think otherwise. I bit my tongue, because I knew in that moment that if I told him the truth,
If I confessed the New York night and the months of silence and the cold distance I'd let creep between us, he might not look at me the same way. He might not be grateful. He might not be anything but hurt and angry and betrayed. And even though part of me screamed that honesty was the only way forward, the larger part of me, the selfish part, couldn't bear to shatter the fragile peace we'd rebuilt. Dinner ended with tiramisu and espresso, and we stumbled out into the cold Chicago night, our breath forming clouds in the streetlight. Mark held my hand as we walked to the car, and I leaned my head against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the comfort that had been there all along, waiting for me to notice it. We drove home in comfortable silence, the city lights fading into the quiet suburbs. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed Ethan's light was on, a thin strip of yellow glowing through the blinds. I wondered if he was awake, if he'd been waiting for us to come home, if he was worried about what might happen if Mark and I were alone for too long. But I pushed the thought away, telling myself it was just teenage insomnia, nothing more. We went inside, and Mark headed straight for the bedroom, loosening his tie and humming a song I didn't recognize. I told him I'd be right in, that I wanted to check on Ethan first. He nodded, still humming, and disappeared down the hall. I climbed the stairs, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood. The door to Ethan's room was cracked open, just a sliver, and I could see the blue glow of his laptop screen flickering in the dark. I pushed it open gently, expecting to find him watching YouTube or playing some game. But what I saw made my blood freeze.
Ethan was sitting at his desk, his back to me, but he wasn't alone. Chloe was there, perched on the edge of his bed, and she was crying. Not just crying, sobbing, her shoulders shaking with the force of it. And Ethan, my son, the boy who looked at me with such cold disdain on that lake dock, was holding her hand and whispering something I couldn't hear. I froze in the doorway, not sure if I should announce myself or back away and pretend I hadn't seen. But before I could decide, Ethan turned. He looked at me, and his face was a mask of anguish. "Mom," he said, his voice hollow, "Chloe just broke up with me." I stepped into the room, my heart lurching. "What? Why?" Chloe looked up at me, her eyes swollen and red. "She told me," she choked out, and the words hung in the air between us. "Ethan told me everything. About New York, about the lie. He said he couldn't keep pretending with me, that the guilt was eating him alive and I deserved to know the truth. And I don't know how to process it. I don't even know if I want to." My body went cold. All the warmth from dinner, all the joy, all the carefully constructed peace, it evaporated in an instant, replaced by a dread so profound I could barely stay upright. "Ethan," I whispered, "what have you done?" He stood up, and I saw tears streaming down his face for the first time since we were at the lake. "I couldn't do it anymore," he said, his voice cracking. "I couldn't lie to her. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. She asked me what was wrong, why I'd been so distant, and I broke. I told her everything. I told her about the video, about watching you with that guy, about carrying your secret for months, and now she's looking at me like I'm a monster, like I'm complicit in something horrible, and maybe I am." Chloe stood up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at me, and there was no sympathy in her gaze, no understanding, just disgust.
"I'm sorry," she said, but her tone made it clear she wasn't sorry at all. "I can't be part of this. I can't be part of a family that's built on lies." "I'm sorry," she said, but her tone made it clear she wasn't sorry at all. "I can't be part of this. I can't be part of a family that's built on lies." And then she walked past me, down the stairs, out the front door, and out of our lives. Ethan sank onto his bed, his head in his hands, and I stood there, frozen, watching my son's heart break because of my mistakes. I had no idea how to fix it. I had no idea if it could be fixed. But I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like ice, that the universe had just handed me a bill for all the karma I'd been racking up. And the worst part was, Mark still didn't know. The truth was a ticking bomb, and I had no idea when it would finally explode.